Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Cheah Kai Wai again. You may remember from the previous interview, he's a Singaporean writer of all sorts of really interesting and good fiction, largely in heroic adventure sorts of things, but lots of different genres. I read his story Invincible, which was really good. So we had talked about writing more generally, and then we sat down again because one of his technically unofficial, but should be official if there is anyone to make it official, titles is Herald of the Pulp Revolution. And so we sat down to talk about the Pulp Revolution, what it is and its aims, and just various things about writing in the pulp style and what people are learning from the masters of the pulp age and applying those things in a modern context, because the Pulp Revolution is very much about writing good fiction now, not about trying to be some sort of historical reenactment. And so we sat down to talk about all these things, and it was a very interesting conversation again. And so here it is, and I hope you enjoy it. So to kick off the subject of the Pulp Revolution, and to me, an interesting place to start is where the pulps got their name. Because there's something interesting to me in that they got their name not from anything about the writing, but rather about the printing. That they were stories written that were printed on pulp paper, i.e. the cheapest medium of the day. And so contrasting that to the modern era of the Pulp Revolution, where an awful lot of stuff is printed over an even cheaper medium, digital, which makes pulp look downright expensive. I find that an interesting starting point. So, sort of to kick off in the Pulp Revolution, it's certainly not the printing that is that we're harking back to now. So, what would you say is the spirit and the essence of the Pulp Revolution?
The essence of the Pulp Revolution is to study the grandmasters of the past, the way they wrote, the lessons they had to teach us, and to apply them to a modern day context, to the current publishing industry, just their writing, to customers' taste. You can say the fusion of the old and the present.
Now, okay, so I guess let's the next place to go with that is when referencing the grandmasters. What would your list of the grandmasters of the pulp era be?
Different authors have different answers for that. My own list would include Robert E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, C.M. Moore, Leigh Brackett, Clark Ashton Smith, and E.E. Smith. The author of Landsman.
So actually, and to complement that, what are the characters of this series, the stories they're best known for?
For Robert E. Howard, you've got Conan, the most famous character ever, and an architect in his own right. But you also have Solomon Kane, a Puritan who is on a world-spanning crusade to destroy evil, as well as Alborak, an American adventurer who wanders Central Asia. From H.P. Lovecraft, there isn't a central character, not the least because most of the characters are nameless to begin with. But there is this general attitude, you can say, the sense that the humans are just a tiny speck in the universe, and there are greater and far more powerful forces out there. And no God is coming to save you from them.
Cthulhu, by the way, was well associated with Lovecraft. Yep. So just wondering, does he actually feature very prominently in the stories, or is this just one of those cases where he makes for great art, and so he became an incredibly popular character despite maybe only being on one page?
Yeah, it's like that. Cthulhu only shows up in one story, as I recall, and only at the end. And even then, he's not even described very well. Maybe just a few paragraphs. But Cthulhu is iconic of Lovecraft's mythos. As an eldritch being from beyond the stars, something so powerful and so alien that drives people mad just by looking at it, of alien geometries and distant, unknowable histories.
Mm.
So, this is Lovecraft's more like an attitude and aesthetic as opposed to a well-known character. As for Leigh Brackett and C.M. Moore, you can say that they created the strong female character archetype, the originals, man. Another way you see today, these female characters are actually feminine. Like C.M. Moore's Jewel Jory, for example. She's the classic warrior woman, but she's definitely a woman. She is very focused on social relationships. She uses feminine wiles. She comports herself as a woman would, appealing to emotions, leveraging on relationships, on and when she faces trials, she faces them with she takes them head on and shoulders them all head on. She doesn't complain, she just endures. She endures all the agonies that her enemies can throw at her, be it strange alien landscapes, mm, memories of her past being replayed over and over again, possible damnation even. So you can tell straight away that Jiro is written by a woman, and yet it is written for a mass audience appeal. That is, she's strong. She is, I mean, physically strong. She does wear armor and use a sword. But she's also emotionally strong. That she keeps pushing through trials in her own way, and well, I think it's a mindset and the way the story focuses on emotions, not just actions. It's a very feminine tone to CMO's work and Leigh Brackett's as well. And it's something that the male pulp authors don't write. The male, suppose the male pulp grandmasters tend to focus on action and plot, whereas the females talk a lot about emotions, especially enduring negative emotions. If you get my drift.
I do. That does make sense. It's the same sort of thing, but with a different focus, a different perspective.
Yeah.
On the same sort of thing. Still with adventure, but looking at a little, focusing on different parts because different people appreciate different things in life. That makes sense, certainly. Interesting. The yeah. Well, it's also interesting. Well, at the time period, I mean, it depends, but I mean, there was still something of an appreciation for feminine characteristics at the time. Before the sort of modern worship of the male characteristics as the only characteristics, wherein you then get the strong female character who's just male with a little bit longer hair. I remember Chesterton, just described it as he summarized it as a feminist seems to be a person who dislikes the chief feminine characteristics. And that's in the early 1900s, which is even sort of before the pulp era. But you can really sort of see that playing through into the much more modern stuff, where I'm pretty sure, like for recent movies, what they basically do for female characters is write them as a male and then just cast a woman into the role. They don't believe that there are any differences whatsoever between men and women, so they just they don't really write any. Although they don't generally have very manly men who are writing these things anyway, so you get kind of a curious thing. I mean, you get like people like Joss Whedon, who are not very discernibly masculine, So I guess in some sense it becomes a little bit more of a middle of the road sort of perspective anyway. Um, but so actually something I remember actually as I was actually going over um, some notes I had when I had interviewed P. Alexander, who ran Sova magazine, and he was talking about the pulps and some misconceptions. And one of the things he mentioned that I thought very interesting was that there's this idea that the pulps were written for children, but because they have adventure in them, but that at the time that wasn't their audience. That they're even I think he mentioned that the few cases where it was, they tended to get away from that for marketing reasons. They had primarily an adult audience, and so I okay, so to put that into sort of a question and topic, um, so writing, there's an obvious love that children have for adventure because they haven't lived life yet, and so they're kind of longing for it. But there's also adventure that even people who have a taste of having lived life like, and so what would you say about recapturing that adventure that appeals to adults? And trying to get that within a modern, for modern audiences.
Well, that is something Paul Rev is seriously thinking about on our on-again, off-again conversations. How to capture the spirit of adventure and awe and wonder. I mean, we look at things, ordinary life is pretty boring. You wake up, go to work, spend how many hours in the office, come back, rinse, repeats. People don't like that drudgery and they don't want to read the drudgery. So if you want to talk about adventure specifically, you want to take people away from the humdrum everyday life, away from the tedious office work or wherever it is they work at, in some place where they can feel like they're actually doing something significant, or this is a character doing something significant, a character they can identify with, doing heroic things, getting stuff done, doing good in the world. I think earlier today, Daddy Warpig mentioned that superhero comics are heroic fantasies because people want to feel like they're the heroes, fighting bad guys and stuff. I think that taps into the spirit of adventure pops are trying to capture and what we in Pop Rap want to do as well.
Now, when you take, I'm trying to think because you definitely still find a lot of heroic sorts of things aimed at children, but they do. Yeah, I'm thinking to some of the no, John Carter of Mars would he be in the pulp era?
Yeah, late Paul, I guess.
Okay, because that's Burroughs, right? John Carter of Mars, or is my memory deceiving me?
John Carter of Mars. Let me think. It's yeah, Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Okay, because I never read it. I've read about it. Tarzan, I've read a bunch of.
Mm-hmm.
And Tarzan, I really is Tarzan considered pulp? Well, I mean, is it? I mean, it was published as novels, not in the
Yeah,
pulps, but
published in the same time frame, I think.
okay. And so John Carter of Mars, I know is literally a person who's taken out of his sort of everyday life and into Mars.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so and I've seen a few people I think who are often considered in pulp rev who um, take that approach. Although it's often given the Japanese name of something like isekai, is it?
Isekai.
Isekai, which has that same basic premise, right, of a person taken out of their normal life and brought to a fantastic new place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, how popular do you see that? Just sort of currently within the pulp revolution, how popular is that sort of story?
Let's see. Among all the popular writers I know, there are maybe two people who wrote isekai stories, including me. Like, Pop Rev doesn't think much of isekai stories, to be honest.
Okay.
If we hang around for discussions, inevitably find reference to isekai trash at some point. I mean, we understand the point of isekai stories. You want an ordinary guy taken from the familiar place to a strange new world in supercharged fantasy, adventure, etc., etc. But these days, isekais handle ham-fistedly or very clumsily.
Mm.
It's basically take your ordinary Japanese high schooler, plunk him in some vaguely medieval European land, give him over all kinds of superpowers, chi powers as they call it, and then they let him run loose. That's it. You know?
Well, if you're going outright to anime, yeah. I have a friend who's into anime, and so I hear periodically about some of them. I think his favorite was a version like that where the guy's main problem was he was ludicrously overpowered, and his main problem was something like he couldn't do his mega super ultra attack more than once in a day. But you only found out about this when he overcame the problem anyway. But leaving anime to the side, is there much? Well, okay. So if you go back into something like the 20s and the 30s, or even the 40s, you still had a lot of well, there's an interesting contention. Actually, let me back up even slightly one step. C.S. Lewis had a very interesting contention because he wrote a number of science fiction stories after the pulp era. But he wrote a number of science fiction stories, and he had actually it was great. They were called science-fiction at the time. But he had the contention that what he referred to as science fiction was really in continuity with the great epics of the time. So that back in the time of Homer, if you wanted to send somebody to a fantastic land where all the normal rules of physics don't apply, all you have to do is have them get lost at sea and show up somewhere. And so far as anyone knows, that could well be if you sail too far away, the gods alone know what will happen to you. And so by the time of the early 1900s or even the mid 1900s, that doesn't really work across the sea. I mean, we have a pretty good sense of what's across the sea because people travel there in metal ships all the time. And so you have to set it somewhat further out, and hence you get to, instead of just taking a boat and landing somewhere using modern technology, you have to use somewhat futuristic technology to get off the Earth and get someplace else in order to be someplace where nobody knows whether or not the rules, the rules of physics apply and so on. But that it's the same basic idea of just sending somebody off to someplace fantastic to experience different things. And so an interesting example was in one of Lewis's books, the channels on Mars contained civilizations, and the conceit that he used was that the atmosphere on Mars wasn't very good at Mars ground level, but in these channels that were far below, you had enough atmospheric pressure to actually live by. And it was slightly shaky in his day. Like, it was a common idea, but it was mostly it was starting to be dispelled around the time he had written this. And certainly by now we know that what the channels of Mars actually are. So you can't really do that. And so you either have to send people really incredibly far away, which then runs into the problem of you need faster than light travel, and so that sort of magic, or you just throw people really far into the future, or something along those lines. But do you see anybody investigating the idea of sort of recapturing some of that spirit by doing things like setting something like deep inside of underground on Mars, rather than having to throw people incredibly far away? Because I think there's a little bit of a sense that the magic of we've had decades of Star Trek and so on, but I think there's a sense that the magic of simply sending people really far away, it doesn't actually work. I mean, faster than light travel is just pure magic in so many ways that you might as well just have straight outright magic and be plain old fantasy. Do you see people playing around with trying to recapture some of that spirit of wonder, but closer to home? Sending people really far away has kind of lost its magic, and so looking for it closer to home.
Let's see. I remember a few Pulp authors playing around the idea. I remember reading a serial once set in an actual hollow Earth. Instead of going so far away, our hero was abducted and taken to a place deep underground. And lo and behold, there's an actual civilization under the earth, complete with its own sun, air, water supplies, and whatnot. And hero has to break free from these captors. Elsewhere, I think Kosovo ran the Allergy Earth special, along with Misha Burnett and other authors, set in a shared universe. It's set on Earth, but a contrafactual Earth, an Earth that was formerly ruled by the Old Ones from the Cthulhu mythos. In this setting, the Old Ones are the age of the Old Ones is over. They are either dying out or committing suicide. But all their other lesser creations, like Final Fantasy races, Shoggoths, and whatnot, are still around. So there is still a Earth, but it's not an Earth as we understand it. It's an Earth populated by humans and alien creatures, an Earth where magic is around the corner, as well as danger and madness. There's also another recurring Kosovo author, I think. Can't recall the name offhand, but his stories are set in the very far-flung future Earth. So far in the future, magic has returned. It's really a fantasy story, just that it takes it's trappings of Earth with humans and earthly language, but otherwise you have magic, you have demons, you have other standard fantasy tropes. I think the whole point of this exercise is to take the characters and with them the reader to a strange and unknown land where anything could possibly happen. And since it's unknown, the possibility for adventure is endless. Just happens to be on Earth or a version of Earth as opposed to a galaxy far, far away.
That opening of George Lucas's execution was interesting and uneven, but I've got to say that the two brilliant ideas he had were one, going with the lightsaber, just the particular way, because I know that other people had fire swords, but the lightsaber in particular, just in its dimensions and so on, was a brilliant idea. But so too, just the opening lines, that a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there's something truly brilliant in that opening, that really captured the imagination, I think, in an interesting way. And so that's actually a really curious subject, the interplay of in fantasy, the interplay of fantasy with plausibility. And so I'm curious, from a story construction perspective, what do you see as the interplay between you want to tell stories where fantastic things happen because that's the interesting part, but if you can keep elements of it believable in some sense of believable, it seems to be far more interesting. And so when you're writing stories, how do you think of that interplay between believability and fantasy, or being fantastic, perhaps is?
I can tell you, it's a very difficult balancing act. So what you want to do is to decide what you want to keep grounded and what you want to keep fantastic straight from the start. In my case, for example, I make sure that the martial arts are authentic, no matter what, as well as the weapons and armor of the era. With that as a starting base, you have technology and societal mindsets, as well as how humans will tend to behave in the society and with each other. And from there, you can train on the fantastic stuff, magic, crystals, monsters, what have you, and see how they influence all the stuff that's grounded, or is more or less grounded. Like in my story Dungeon Samurai, the characters use what is called we call them spear forks in English. Imagine a long spear with two prongs. The Japanese use those to arrest criminals. When Dungeon Samurai, they use them to detect traps. They use the prongs to type out tripwires and whatnot. Likewise, in Dungeon Samurai, the samurai use spears as a main weapon. Jumonji Yari, that is, spears with a cross-shaped blade. Because the environment is so close, they shorten them to about 90 centimeters or so. So they're called Tei Jumonji Yari, or hand spears. So in a sense, you want to start with what you are familiar with and then adapt them to the fantastic elements that you introduce into your story. But not so much that you lose the groundedness altogether.
So, would you say that an approach, would it be fair to describe the approach you use as now? Because I assume that's the start of the construction, but the start of the story was starting with what fantastic element you wanted. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And would you say that it's fair to describe it as you pick, in a sense, the fantastic is a little bit like a daydream. And so you pick what sort of daydream you want to have, and then once you've picked that, you then ground everything else.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. And so now, another question actually relating to, so an interesting subject, we talked about to hit on is the pulps' business, and that that the pulps were, I mean, the people writing in order to earn their living, and writing impressively quickly to earn their living too.
Mm-hmm.
So, as distinct from, well, no, the funny thing is, of course, lots of people who wrote stories long before the pulps did so for money.
Mm-hmm.
Who was it? Johnson, right? What's his name? Johnson. I can't remember who said only a fool ever wrote except for money. The one who had the friend named Boswell who wrote the life of him. That Johnson.
Mm.
And I mean, he's in the 1800s, or possibly earlier. I forget exactly. But anyhow, so to focus more on the pulps.
Samuel Johnson.
Samuel Johnson. Thank you. That's torturing me, so I appreciate that. But so we sort of seem to in the contemporary time period inherited this ideal of writing as the art form, but not just as the art form, but as this sort of spiritual art form where it's really a goal that should be reached for but never actually achieved. So sort of the ideal writer in this odd twisted sort of vision we're often presented with is the person who revises and revises and is constantly throwing his work out and starting afresh and always revising. Then finally he'll die without ever having published, and that's the true artist. And so that is perhaps an exaggeration, but not much of an exaggeration from sort of the perception of what art style writing has. Or alternatively, it's sort of like a session where you sort of cheap out on the therapist and the reader is your therapist, where you just unload all your psychological issues on the reader. It's a lot cheaper than paying for a therapist, right? You get people to pay you to be your therapist. So
Yeah.
I can see the attraction in a sense. I've never had a therapist, but I can see the attraction for someone who might need one. So there are those. Are there other things in the modern sort of art style you think that'd be good to contrast, and then by way of contrast, describe what the pulp ethos of writing is?
I could talk all day about that. Okay, so to give foreign listeners an idea, in Singapore, the writing scene is collectively termed Singlit, or Singapore literature. Every so often, you hear everyone from local writers to poets to the National Arts Council to various businesses promoting Singlit. Buy Singlit, read Singlit, write Singlit, etc., etc., etc. So, what's exactly Singlit? It's literature with capital L. like what you said, right? It's about high art, playing with language, character drama, Singapore culture, Singapore dialogue, Singapore events, Singapore this, Singapore that. It's not a knock against it, but it's just so utterly boring.
Actually, just a question, because I've read about this a little bit on your blog, and something that has always kind of perplexed me is that sounds like a great that sounds very marketable outside of Singapore. Because I mean, people like to read about environments they're not familiar with, and so to read about what a culture is like with having to go to all the trouble and expense of actually going there
Yeah.
is great for all sorts of people. So, but this seems a little bit backwards that people can't be exotic to themselves, and so I don't quite understand why is the national literature of Singapore so Singapore focused without even trying to export this anywhere else.
I don't know. Julie, I don't know, and this is what frustrates me a lot. I mean, only until recently you'll find Singaporean books on Amazon and elsewhere. A lot of it is Singaporean literature writing company, Singaporean publishers promoting books to Singaporeans, books about Singapore to Singaporeans, that is. And it's like, why don't I read this? I really know what's going on here. Like, why do you want to read about the trials and travails of an entire neighborhood that's undergoing an en bloc sale, right? That its entire flat is being sold off collectively. Or why do you want to read about a secondary school romance if the frame focus is just about how English it is, you know?
I well, I've got to say, as an American, this could be interesting simply to hear about a place that would be very expensive for me to travel to.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have a much harder time understanding why somebody in Singapore would be. I mean, who wants? I don't. Yeah, I mean, not obviously. You know, you're not
Mm-hmm.
plugged into that scene, so you don't really have the answers either. But it's such a strange thing to the idea that you should be reading about the sort of ordinary life of people who might literally live down the street from you. Um,
The
not,
problem
not
is,
that you
yeah,
don't find some of that everywhere, um, but usually at least somewhat idealized. I mean, you'll find all sorts of books, by Americans set in America, by English people set in England, but then with some sort of hook to it, where there's something interesting, like they're
yeah,
solving a murder mystery, or one of them's a part of the nobility, or
yeah.
something
And,
like that.
and this the thing. What is it about a hook? Stanley doesn't have a hook. It's just ordinary life, day in, day out. This hook is just, oh, something's happening to the neighborhood, or lifetimes are changing. We're moving to independence now. Everybody get ready for this and that, for the departure of the British. It's just a lot of it is presented as ordinary daily life.
Hmm.
The focus is on wordplay, on language, on drama, but not on how the readers will react to it. Like, why is it interesting to the reader? You know?
Hmm. I'm curious. Do you think there's an attempt to try to? Because Singapore is a quite young country.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I remember actually the interesting thing, the way you put it in one blog post, that your country is younger than your parents.
Yeah.
Um, but so, do you think that there's some element of a conscious attempt to try to forge a cultural identity?
Hmm. In one sense, yes, because of all the emphasis on Singaporean culture and language and whatnot. But I sense they're going overboard. The focus is so much on everyday life that there's no room for an interesting story.
Hmm. Okay, so to contrast that then to um, the pulps, because in some sense, I think that's where at least a non-trivial number of the American high art types would love for American literature to go.
Mm-hmm.
Although ideally, I mean, amongst the American high art types, my impression is that they'd prefer if it was the mentally ill segment of America. But that said, I think they want a similar thing to what Singaporean literature sounds like it's achieved. That is to say, to be sort of a lot of work to read. And so, using those sort of as a point to contrast to the Pulp Revolution, what would you say are the main goals of the pulps and their goals that are trying to be recaptured?
They want to be fun. They want to be fun to read. They want to keep the readers engaged and to excite the readers. They want to focus on universal ideas and values like heroism, romance, masculinity, femininity. They want to take readers somewhere different, somewhere far from the ordinary life. Just let them escape reality for a while. And if you get cultural insight, all the better. They're not trying to push a message or to consciously forge a cultural identity. They're just there for the reader's benefit. Instead of focusing on language and cultural experiences and history and whatnot, the emphasis is on the characters in their story, the things they do, the plot that results from it, the world building, all the other fantastical elements. And in the case of isekai story that I mentioned earlier, it's also about culture. There's also an element of culture shock of how the characters adapt to the environment they're in, and by extension, how the reader can do it as well. Like how they're applying out what they think they know about their past life to the situation they're in now, and how relevant it can be. In addition, the pulps have a focus. There's this common misconception that the pulps are low-draw entertainment. Some pulps are, yeah, but the really powerful ones are more than just words on paper. They are printed on pulps, but doesn't mean they're cheap. Just that they're widely available. They're cheap so that they're widely available for people to appreciate. If you read the prose of Robbie Howard, for example, you can just feel the vitality flowing on the page. In H.P. Lovecraft, his command of English is incredible. The use of archaic language, the slow build-up, the purple prose is famous for. These are all deliberate stylistic choices that create an incredible aesthetic experience that high literature wants to recreate. I think high lit wants to have this experience of reading, not just the story, but how the words and the prose make you feel. The pulp masters I've seen excellent at evoking a kind of complex emotions depending on what you're reading. In the case of Conan, it evokes a sense of cyclical history, the rise and fall of ancient civilizations, the triumph of the barbarian over decadent civilizations, and yet there's also this sense of fertility, because the Conan's own time is doomed to the miss of time as well. As a H.P. Lovecraft, you sense that there are things greater than humanity, but they are indifferent towards you or actively malicious towards you. And it's so unfathomable that even trying to attempt to understand them drive you mad. And this sensation of madness or being standing precipice staring to the abyss is something that is an emotion that his prose alone can capture. Not just the plot, the characters, but the stylistic choices, the word choices, the arrangement of paragraphs, everything. And in this sense, the pulps have something in common with high lit, the artistic significance of the language used.
Mm.
But personally, I think the pulps did it better than singlets.
It's kind of a curious thing, thinking of high literature. Obviously, I'm not familiar with singlet, but um, from descriptions, it sounds a bunch like high literature I've read, and that's produced here. And in many ways, it strikes me that high art, high literature are very often the attempts to capture the artistic effects you get in things like a Conan story, um, or plenty of others, but by people who aren't strong enough to enjoy an adventure, where they're timid people, and so they the adventure and the excitement is sort of too much for them. Um, Chesterton had a really interesting description that I can't remember the particular words, but roughly that humor requires energy, that adventure requires energy, and people don't always have it. And so there's a way, there's a great line towards the end of his book Orthodoxy, where he talks about that he talks about the subject of monotony, and and how um, that monotony is often regarded as a sign of things being dead, but it's actually really properly the sign of things being alive. If you look at the people who actually enjoy monotony, they're the people who are overflowing with life, like children, for example, who just want the same thing to happen over and over and over again. And they say, do it again. And generally the grown up does it again until he falls over. Um, and it had this great line about how it may not be that the sun arises every day out of mechanical necessity, but because every morning God says, "Do it again" to the sun, and every night, "Do it again" to the moon. Um, that God may have the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. Um, but he went on, and he was talking about the idea of mirth and of happiness. And he had this great line about we're perhaps permitted tragedy as a sort of a merciful, almost half holiday, that we're given points where points in our lives where we can take a break from having to be happy, because it's just sort of too much for us to be happy on a continual basis. And high art kind of strikes me a bit like those vacations where people don't have the energy to actually be happy, when they don't have the energy to see a human being fully alive. And so they need to see, like, three-quarters dead people described with beautiful language, because they can sort of tolerate the three-quarters dead people. And it doesn't knock them over. It doesn't overwhelm them, and so they can deal with that, and so they can appreciate the wordplay and the language, as long as the people involved aren't really doing much of anything. Um, and so, yeah, a lot of American high art, though it's not about, it's not quite just what's going on in this neighborhood. A lot of it will focus on, from the bits of it that I've seen. I mean, stuff isn't generally very tolerable, but all the same, the bits of it I've seen, they tend to focus on somebody wants something that's not very important, but it's awfully important to them. And so you've got this riveting emotions about things that don't really matter very much. And other people who have riveting other emotions because they're just really selfish and don't care. And this other person existing is kind of getting in their way too. And so, I mean, I think it kind of also makes sense why people who are at least partially mentally ill kind of gravitate to this as well, because if you're just mentally ill, then trivial things can become massive problems. Um, or just, people who are raised truly badly, they also seem to gravitate to this. Again, for similar reasons, I think, because, if you're sufficiently unable to cope with other human beings, what you want to have for dinner tonight is a massive problem and can generate truly momentous emotions. Um, and so there may be an element of that. I think that high literature is for people who are too tired to enjoy more significant things. But to take that to the pulp revolution and the more significant things, um, without it being a message, or without it being people who just don't know where their Western Union office is located or can't find their blog software. Um, that that there may also be an element, and I'm curious if you think that there is, of where the literature eh, traveled back in time a bit, and especially in America, but possibly too in Commonwealth countries. 100 years ago, the literature with which most people would be familiar would be the Bible. And the Bible is all full of stories of people in the moments of really critical moments of virtue, critical moments of temptation, the moments when entire nations depend upon the choices of a few people. And it's little snippets of their lives where you hear the few weeks, the few months of their life when the fate of a nation depended on their virtue. Um, and so that the one thing the pulps may reflect is taking that sort of role of telling stories of those few critical months in a person's life, and so bringing some of that same thing that for most of us there won't we'll do a few important things in our life, probably not a large number overall of really critical things that have a very wide ranging effect, but for many people we'll have a few. I mean, something simple like getting married is at least one fairly big and major event that affects a whole heck of a lot of people. um, and uniting families and providing for future children. I mean, there are a bunch of people whose lives are pretty seriously affected by something like a marriage. um, and so the what do you think of that idea that part of the daydreaming aspect, part of the adventure aspect, is it's not just escapism, but also it's looking at those moments of great importance because they do occasionally come up in our lives, and so in a sense we prepare for them by considering them and thinking about them and thinking about how people can act in these moments of great import.
Mm. Well, that makes sense. Stories are just there for entertainment. The very best stories teach life lessons as well. Be it stories from the Bible or stories from everyday fiction. They show how a character acts in a given moment, make it into context. And so a reader can extrapolate from that to their own lives and think about how they could act, or at least how their favorite characters would have acted in the situation, and what they can learn from there.
And I would take it one step further. It's not just how they act, but then seeing the consequences of their action.
Yeah.
Um, it's actually a bit of writing advice I was giving to a friend that you're not trying to send a message because that's propaganda, but you're teaching truths by showing an event and then looking at what actually happens. So that if you have, when you have unrealistic consequences, that's when you run into you're teaching the wrong lessons. That's when you've got bad fiction. And when you have realistic consequences, that's when you have good fiction, morally good fiction. I mean, that's when you're teaching things about life, but they don't have to be good consequences. Having somebody who makes terrible decisions, then bad things happen, is teaching. Is communicating truths about life.
Hmm.
So, and there's sort of a bonus because if you're being true, I mean, in your consequences, your characters will be doing things that actually are realistic and make them good characters. Um, so um, not that one in a story is going to show all of the consequences, but to take a trivial example of doing it wrong, would be you have somebody who spends the first 40 years of her life partying, and then everything, and then just lives happily ever after. Not making any commitments to anybody, nothing but living for herself, just nothing but hard drinking, hard drugging, hard partying for the first 40 years of her life, and then no problems, everything's great. Is an example of a morally bad story because this isn't how life actually works. It's also an example of just bad characterization because that's not how life actually works. That's not what a human being would do. You're not just going to be utterly happy in, especially continuing to just do hard partying and drugging in your 40s and in your 50s. Um, So, uh, given that consequences often have to be limited because you have to end a story at some point, um, but do you see that too as part of it that of the inter at least foreshadowing the consequences towards the end as being actually part of the part of the a good story?
Yeah. If you're doing a story right, then you have to signal to the audience what might happen next. Not all the time, certainly, but enough that what happens next is believable. Like in my own series, Confident Chronicles. In that story, a Black Ops agent forms a contract with an archangel to do his bidding in exchange for powers. That is, he fights evil with his powers, but those powers will derive a cost. Every time he uses them, it eats away at his soul. So as the series progresses, he comes in contact with well, with other entities, including a fallen angel, other monsters, and whatnot. And every time he uses powers, well, there are consequences. And those consequences come to fruition in book 3
Mm.
in a very tangible manner. Because in books 1 and 2, he's constantly warned about it. You see him suffering the effects of it. And it just keeps getting worse and worse. And then he feels he has no choice but to use his powers, or he'll die anyway. It puts him in a haunted dilemma.
Hmm.
So,
Interesting.
yeah. So, if you have a series, especially, you want to play out the consequences over time, not just in one book, but multiple books. And every major action must resonate, must reverberate throughout the rest of the series and influence everything from there.
Hmm. Interesting. Now, actually, segueing slightly from the series, because one thing about a series is it contains a lot of words. Um, One of the other things the Pulp Revolution is known for is what's been described as pulp speed, or that is to say, writing quickly. Rather impressively quickly, I must say, as somebody who's not nearly at pulp type speeds. So, if you could give a description of pulp speed, I mean, you have on your blog, but if you wouldn't mind just summarizing. And then a question I'm very interested in is how on earth you achieve it.
Pulse speed is writing at the speed of the pulp grandmasters. Many people can churn out 2, 3, 4, 5,000 words a day, every day, for weeks and months and years on end, without a break, or at least without a noticeable break. The entry point for Pulp Speed is Pulp Speed 1, which is, I think, almost 2.8k words every day. Then it just gets even higher from there. 2.5k words, 4k words, 5k, 6k, 10k, and so on and so forth. Getting there, it requires a lot of time management and stamina, which then implies you gotta look up to your health. So in my case, every day I have to carve out between 3 and 4 hours. Also working up early and working late at night and working at night. You need to look after your health, so you gotta sleep right, eat right, and exercise right, or you'll be too ill to carry on, or at least too tired. And unlike the power writers of the past, the new technologies, word processors, autofill, and voice dictation software. Many writers these days use voice dictation software to churn out 3, 4, 5k words in a sitting, or even more. So it's easier to achieve pulp speed with current technology than with typewriter. Not to say that it's easy, just easier.
Yeah,
But
well,
it takes
that's
a lot of
funny.
commitment.
Yeah, although as a touch typist, I've never found the rate at which I can type to be the limiting factor of how fast I can write. I mean, not everybody, I suppose, is a touch typist. Um, so I can see the technological side there. But when it comes to, so I'm at least something I definitely find, and I write in, at least presently, I'm writing primarily in mysteries. And one of the things that I sort of come against, I suppose, um, is like when I meet a new character, it'll take me a little bit of time to really develop the character in my head before I start writing them down. Um, the real tricky ones get to when I have to work out the details and I have to remember the details. Because in a mystery novel, you have to get all the details right. And, remember that if somebody started 4 months ago, you have to actually remember that all the way through, that they started someplace 4 months ago and not 3 months ago. Um, that's the sort of stuff that can be killer. I'm working on ways of organizing that better. But I'm really curious, just from the perspective of writing, um, how do you manage to not hit, how do you manage to not hit blocks where you need to just stop and think for a while about how something is going to proceed?
Very occasionally, but that's often these days. Mostly because I try to set a story before I actually write it. So I think about the plot, the characters, twist, how the characters will interact with each other in every scene, how the action sequences play out, how mysteries are solved. So you want to pre-write the story as much as you can before actually writing it, if you will. So that way you know where you're going and what to do next. So if you ever find yourself lost for words, you go back to your plan, you see how things go, and you go back to your story and write it again. But there will be times when you can't foresee everything, and sometimes obstacles do pop up, so you have to work around them. Just how things go.
Yeah, yeah. At the big level, that's definitely you have to work around it. Now, I'm curious, by the way, is your writing time in large enough blocks? Because one of the things that I find, just with the all the demands of the day I'm a programmer by profession, so during the day I have to get my mind filled with all the details of programs, and then so I've found it takes me some time just to, at the end of everything, to sort of quiet down and then get the characters' voices and personalities back in my head so that um, I can write from them. Um, is that something? I mean, do you find? I mean, do you consciously choose a large block of contiguous time to save time in getting characters' voices into your head, or is this not so much of a problem for you?
I do take some time to get into the right headspace before I write. And whenever I can, I try to schedule uninterrupted time so I can maximize what time I do have.
Okay, and I guess actually, one thing I've noticed. Do you ever or do you find that there are certain types of writing that you find easier to write than others, that may occasionally form a trap where you'll sort of get into it just because it's so fun and easy to write, that you could just sort of stay there instead of moving on? Or at this point, do you just have the do you not have that? Do you just have the discipline to overcome it?
Well, I do find writing two kinds of scenes particularly easier. The first scene is people sitting around discussing situation at hand, consequences, and any philosophical implications. And the second, action scenes. Dungeon Samurai is basically one big extended action scene, interrupted by occasional breaks, by the way. But yeah, you do have to move on from there. Once scene is not finished purpose, you have to move on and remind yourself to do that. You have to maintain discipline to break out the loop and to get on with the story and not drag things out longer than what the reader wants. Because ultimately, you're not just running for yourself, you're also running for your reader. If reader gets bored, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. For me, the two ones. Well, in mystery, people discussing possibilities. Um, they it's just when you're doing one of those scenes, man, the words just sort of flow so quickly. It's easy to not notice just how long the characters have been describing all the different possibilities and theorizing. And to be fair, that is a portion of mystery as a genre. I mean, it's a legitimate part of seeing how the characters think about things and consider. But that's one of those ones I've developed the habit of watching myself on because it is so easy. The other, which is kind of particular to me, is if characters ever start discussing philosophy or theology. It's the easiest scenes in the world to write. I love those scenes. I also love reading them. Um, for me, they're the best part of a book when characters are discussing philosophy or theology. Um, which does get to what you're saying too. It's one of those things where part of it is, to be fair, selecting who your audience is, um, but also part of it is one of those things of having to be careful because you're writing something for you're writing something you're intending to publish in order for it to be read. If you're writing something you don't intend to publish, then you can make it anything you please, and it doesn't matter because, after all, you're not taking up anybody else's time with it. Um, but so within uh, with within the careful plotting of the book before you start to write it. Um, Now, I'm curious, by the way, where do you stay? How do you account for that time? Is that part of the 3 to 4 hours a day you put into writing? Is some of that plotting out future books?
No, I have separate plotting and writing time. So when I'm writing, I'm not plotting, and vice versa. Save for emergencies, that is.
Yeah, yeah. No battle plan survives the enemy. Contact with the enemy.
Oh yeah.
Um, I'm curious. So, do you plot your next book concurrently in like on a weekly basis, concurrently with writing the current one, or do you do it? You write until you're done, then you plot the next one, then you write the next one.
Hmm. Well, in my current series, what I did was to figure out what each book would cover, and the general thrust of each, and the general story arc for the entire series. Then I plot each book, write it, then plot the next one, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so and does that have the effect of keeping the current book just sort of more in your head, so that you don't would you describe that multitasking is often a trap?
It is. Multitasking, it just divides your attention all over the place. Even when getting done, you have to focus and commit your entire being to it. So I don't plot and write at the same time. I plot first, then I write and move on.
Gotcha. Now, actually, a question I had completely I hadn't even really thought of, but finally occurred to me, which is a really subject I've never seen anyone talk about actually with regard to Pulp Revolution. That is editing.
Hmm.
How much time do you put into how much time do you put into editing? And I mean, obviously it comes after you write it. Um, but how do you? What is the pulp perspective on editing, and how much do you modify a story in editing?
Well, the official program dogma on editing is simple. Clean up your mistakes, which is the best quality work you can do at a time, but don't dwell on it. You're not trying to create something that's absolutely perfect. Perfection comes from writing even more stories. So you edit what you can, move on to the next one, write it, and write an even better story. So in my case, I budget about 2 weeks to edit a story from start to finish. Usually takes a bit less than that. Barring any major additions or changes, it's good enough. After after I correct all the mistakes, I just move on from there.
Hmm. Interesting. Interesting. So now, what would can you give me an example of what when you say, not necessarily from your own work, but can you give me an example when you say learning from mistakes and moving on as opposed to fixing them? What sort of mistake are you talking about there?
Hmm. Maybe stylistic choices, for example. Like maybe you could use a different word or a different phrase here and there. Or maybe character should act in another way that make the story more interesting. Or maybe stated some maybe you stated the wrong name. There's a minor error, like you say Pepsi instead of Pepsi Cola or whatever. That kind of thing. Minor mistakes that, while noticeable, don't actually affect overall quality of work very much. There's nothing jarring like a missing scene or a plot hole. And even then, even without they publish and notice the fact, you still learn from it. You can still think, you can still realize that something's wrong and can either go back and patch it, or you can strive to make sure you don't make the same mistake again. To keep your plotting tighter next time. If you know what I mean.
I do. I do. Now, plot holes, for example, are very often the sort of thing that can be plugged with a small amount of work. Not every plot hole. There's some plots that are simply intrinsically impossible or incoherent. But amongst plots that basically work, you will sometimes run into plot holes that are relatively fixable. The classic example would be, up until what would it be, the mid 2000s, people in horror movies never had cell phones. And then finally, at some point, it became ridiculous. So all horror movies then added the scene where the protagonist complains about his cell phone being out of battery in order
Mm-hmm.
to, which is just essentially plugging the plot hole, but it works. I mean, it's a little bit suspicious that for some reason all horror victims all have never charged their batteries. But on the other hand, there's a self-selection effect, I suppose, in the stories wherein the person in the first 3 minutes of the movie just has a charged cell phone, calls for help, and the movie's over, never get made. So it can be chalked up to that selection bias. But so that's, I think, a particularly simply clear example of plugging a plot hole. That, yeah, there's a plot hole there. If they just use their cell phone, this wouldn't be a problem. So, okay, we can just fix that by having the cell phone broken out of battery, whatever. Um, so, in editing, if you noticed a plot hole, would that be in the category of a pluggable plot hole? Plug that during editing as opposed to leaving it and moving on?
You have to plug it. If it affects your reader experience, you have to plug it. Especially the glaringly obvious one. I mean, after all, you are writing for the reader, and you don't want the reader to have a negative experience of reading your work. But at some point, yeah, you're just polishing the diamond.
Okay, so um, would you say it's fair to describe the distinction as if you notice a plot hole, plug it rather than rewrite to eliminate it from the get go, and just learn from that plot hole so that the next time you just eliminate it before it happens rather than plugging it?
Yeah. You want to correct your mistakes, but you don't want to dwell on them. You don't want to keep yourself stuck in a loop of constantly revising and your work over and over again. You just want to move on from there. So do what you can to fix the plot hole and any other mistakes, then move on to the next story. You can only get better if you write more stories, not if you're just revising all the time.
Hmm. And I suppose the flip side of that is if you're able to produce a large number of stories, there are also a large number of stories for the reader to move on to. And so there's because as a reader, I think there's a difference um, in how much sort of in how you appreciate things, how much you notice plot holes, if you're reading things occasionally versus if you're reading a lot of things. The um, imperfections aren't as bad if you're sort of reading with greater velocity.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually probably a good analogy there in television shows. It's really curious that the Netflix era of going back and mainlining shows and all the things you see when you don't read them 1 week apart, when you're not watching a show each episode 1 week apart, but you actually watch 3 or 4 in a day, 2 or 3 days in a row, and suddenly you start noticing how how many things are gotten wrong from 8 episodes ago, but when people watched it, it would have been 8 weeks ago. Um,
Mhm.
so okay, so I'm just trying to think. Anything anything we haven't talked about in the Pulp Revolution you think would be good to hit on before we close?
Mm. Top speed is a virtuous cycle. You want to write fast, write a lot, and you write a lot. And the more stories you write, the better you get at it. You better get at the craft. The better you get at the craft, the more stories you're able to write, the faster you're able to write, and so on and so forth. This is the heart of pop rap, I think. To write quickly without compromising quality. And you want to learn from the best, so you look at the grandmasters of the past. That, I think, is the essence of pop rap.
I see. That certainly makes sense, and it's an interesting contrast to the idea of learning from the masters of the past is not something you see talked about very much when it comes to high art. Um, but in fact, rejecting the masters of the past is almost an ethos amongst the visible makers of high art, anyway. Um, so that's I've got to say, it just intrinsically has a lot going for it. Because it's a much more human way of approaching doing things is to learn from people who knew what they were doing, and so sort of inherently seems like it has something going for it for succeeding. All right, well, it's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much. It's been quite a pleasure again.
Thanks for having me here.
God bless.
You too.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as I had being in it. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.